The End of Enlightenment. This is a title of a book which has just been brought out, published, written by Richard Whatmore, Professor of History at St Andrews University. It's a long book and a very interesting, well-written book. And the theme of the book comes from David Hume, the philosopher's work, which is that for a period in the first half of the 18th century, it appeared that things were improving sufficiently, and knowledge was increasing and reason was increasing, and so light was replacing darkness, enlightenment. And many thinkers were optimistic and hopeful, like Rousseau and others, that human beings could escape at last from the chains of superstition, fanaticism, and poverty and misery. And then, according to this book, doubts arose in Hume's mind and in a number of other people he talks about, that this was indeed going to happen. And one of the main themes of Hume's doubt was that a commercial, mercantile system had emerged in Britain and elsewhere, revolving around the creation of the national debt. And this meant that governments could borrow as much money as they really needed for their ventures, and their ventures were increasingly imperial and expansionist and military. And so you got into a vicious cycle whereby a government, particularly the British, French and others, would borrow huge sums of money to finance wars against each other. And this increased and increased and would, in the end, lead to the crash of Western civilization, and certainly of England and others, forerunners of the Enlightenment. So this is the theme, and it's excellently executed and very convincing. And it's particularly interesting because several times the author makes a direct allusion to the state of the world now. And reading particularly the early parts of the book, I kept putting in the margin "and the United States," because the description that he gives of this mechanism of borrowing and ever-increasing debt is what has been documented very fully now by a number of writers. For example, a book called Has China Won by Kishore Mahbubani shows how you have the military-industrial complex, which is now eating up a huge amount of the national wealth for the production of war weapons and defense, so that America, the defense industry there, accounts for half of all the defense expenditure in the world, and 3 or 4 days of what is spent on defense in America is the annual funding, for example, of the United Nations. So America increases and increases its debt, and people predict that there's going to be a moment when people will lose faith in the American dollar, withdraw from it as an international currency, and the whole system will come crashing down. So what Richard Whatmore describes is the feeling that I've and many other people have had, that in the last 30 years there has been this retreat from enlightenment. There was a short period after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, about 10 years, when it seemed as if at last the world was going to head towards peace and prosperity. A signal and analysis of this was in Fukuyama's famous book, The End of History, And history had ended with America. America was the city on the hill, and it had brought peace and prosperity and defeated its arch rival, and things were now on a steady plane of affluence, which would spread, along with democracy, over the whole face of the earth. And I, as well as others, thought that this was the case, that Europe was now unified, that there was conspicuous progress in development in places like beginning to be in China and India and elsewhere. And so we were in for a golden age. And then, dramatically, with the bombing of the two towers, and particularly the invasion of Iraq, we started over again on the cycle of war. And increasingly over the last 20 years, there's been war after war, and we're now faced with a war within Europe, in Ukraine, and the atrocities in Gaza and elsewhere. So pessimism now reigns again, and this feels like a parallel, and makes Whatmore's book all the more timely. Now, the reflection I have on the book is that what I learnt, which was the early pessimism of Hume and others, was new to me, and so there is a great deal of important material there. But I had myself, before this, written a book called Cosmologies and the Modern World, which will be published next year, in which I looked at 8 paradigms or worldviews and how they shifted. And the third of them that I looked at was the Enlightenment, and particularly the Scottish Enlightenment, and here I focused on Adam Smith and Hume and Robertson and others, and I saw them as hopeful of progress and enlightenment. And then the fourth one was reaction against the French and the Scottish and other enlightenments in the last quarter of the century. So I dated it somewhat later than Whatmore. And I also looked at different kinds of evidence which are not considered much in Whatmore's book. One of them was the Romantic movement, poetry, William Blake, the later Wordsworth and Coleridge and others. They're mentioned just at the end of Whatmore's book, but the literary movement, which increasingly stressed how the world of the later 18th century was somehow losing its magic, its innocence, its integration, its meaning, the dark satanic mills and so on of Blake, was to me an indication of the counter Enlightenment, and it was also to be found in the German and French traditions. So there was a sudden pessimism and fleeing from this world in the Romantic movement in poetry and literature, and that gave you another dimension. The references by Blake to the effects of industrialization is another difference, whereby my explanation for the counter-enlightenment, if you like to call it that, is not philosophic doubt about the mounting national debt and the rest of it, but was caused by 2 dramatic changes in the wider environment in the 18th century. One was the industrial urban revolution, and that hardly figures at all in Whatmore's book, but given the fact that Glasgow, near which is where Adam Smith was a centre of growing mercantile, if not industrial, revolution. It is a terribly important feature. The urbanisation, the rapid growth of London and other cities, the impoverishment of workers, the harder work in the mines and the mills. Smith talks about the debilitating effects of the division of labour and meaninglessness of work if you're just a small cog in the machine. All this was a massive change from about the middle of the 18th century, and I think is an important, very important background feature. A second feature, which I alluded to, but I think is very important, is the growing effects of scientific thought. Basil Willey's old book, The 18th Century Intellectual World, or whatever, and others, show that the effects of Newtonian science and the scientific revolution, certainly for the poets and others, had a very undermining effect, because they challenged the integration and the meaning of life. They were a threat to orthodox religion, and they made the world into a machine, famously a clockwork universe. And for sensitive people, this took away a great deal of its meaning and its magic. And so many people felt that while it brought great benefits, science and technology, it was also an undermining feature. The other factor, which I stressed, and also Whatmore, of course, is the disillusionment caused by the dramatic events of the French Revolution, where all those hopes and dreams and prosperity and liberty turned into a bloodbath, the terror, and then subsequently the new imperialism of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he deals with this quite a bit in some of the later figures that he touches on, and that I saw as absolutely significant. And another difference in emphasis in our books, his accounts are mainly of philosophers and certain writers. A lot of my emphasis is on the reaction shown in the work of Thomas Malthus. Whatmore talks about Godwin's, Thomas Godwin, and his wife Mary Wollstonecraft. But it was Godwin who was the great mentor of Malthus's father, and Malthus's treatise on population, or Principles of Population, the first edition, 1798, was explicitly an attack on Godwin's utopianism. It said, you think that we can go on progressing forever, but in fact we are trapped by the laws of population. The population will rise to fill the resources and then expand beyond that, and the future of mankind is war, famine and disease. He changed his view a little in the second edition in 1803, in fact fundamentally, because he said this was a tendency and might not happen in certain places. But it was Malthus who was the prophet of doom and gloom, the second great economist. There had been elements of this in Adam Smith, because much of Malthus's theory is there in Smith as well, and Smith was pessimistic in certain ways and didn't foresee the Industrial Revolution raising people above a certain ceiling. But for me, it was the end of the century, with around the time of the French Revolution, which was the turning point. So Whatmore's book would make me rethink the timing a little bit, and gives me a whole new dimension in relation to the economic, in other words, banking, the national debt, and so on. Finally, there's another element which might be worth adding in, and is mentioned, I think, but not stressed, and that is the growth of the slave trade, because while this was a pivot or a basis of much of the wealth of Britain and other countries indulging in the slave trade, almost immediately there was also a reaction against it, and the bestiality and racism implicit in it was a cause for a great deal of dismay as well. So what I've written in a very short piece is complementary to Whatmore's much more thorough treatment. And the final point I'd like to make is that, standing right back from all of this, because recently I've been spending a lot of time thinking about China, looking at the West from the Chinese perspective, I suspect that they would think that the temporary enlightenment hope that there would be an everlasting peace, as was proposed, for example, by Kant, and after the final treaties at the end of the 7 Years' War, was a delusion. That if you look at the pattern of Western nationalistic warfare from the downfall of the Romans, if you like, the West is characterized by expansionist empires, the Romans themselves, and then through the ages many more. It's characterized by endless wars between middle-sized nation-states, characterized by huge expenditure and effort to build better and better weapons, and therefore it is a civilization or civilizations which is founded on aggression and warfare and predation and conquest. That is what it looks like from China. So what happened in the 18th and the 19th and then the 20th century is part of a centuries-old pattern, and is very much in contrast with the pattern of Chinese history, which, apart from some terrible civil wars and invasions by the wandering tribesmen nearby, is based on an attempt to keep the peace and order and philosophies which are not either imperial or aggressive. And that is a big contrast, they would say. So Whatmore documents is another example of the weakness, ultimate weakness, internal divisions, and even the important mechanism of national debt, which is now crippling America, is absent in China. There is no vicious circle, because the political elite is not tied up with owning factories and businesses concerned with militarization. There is no industrial military complex of that kind tied in with the financing of the state in China. So while American governments and British governments inexorably have to raise their defense budgets to please the powerful vested interests, China doesn't need to do that. It can do it if it wants for defense and other purposes, but it's not built in to the system, and that again is another huge difference. So to end on a final very small note, a number of my favorite authors are mentioned but not developed. I would have had, if I was writing Richard's book, I think I would have tried to see whether there was more in, for example, Maria Edgeworth, the great novelist, predecessor to Jane Austen, because she analysed a number of these problems that Hume talked about in her book. For example, Castle Rackrent, she looked at the effects of the She was from Ireland, and she looked at the effects of British capitalism in Ireland. In her great book on patronage, called Patronage, she looked at the patron-client system, which was also part of what Hume and others disapproved of. So I would have had more on her. I'd have perhaps brought in more of Tocqueville, who is my hero, who analysed, I mean, it was much later, but he's referring back to the period of the French Revolution, because he was born before it in a noble family. And his works, different books, particularly the Ancien Régime, but also the book on America, has some brilliant analysis of what is wrong with the Western system and how it will lead towards despotism. I might also, if I were writing such a book, have more on the portrayal of this change and the criticism of Western capitalism in art, thinking of the cartoonists, thinking of Hogarth, thinking of Gilray and others. There was a constant theme right through the 18th century of portrayal of the downside, the underside, the miseries created by this Western system. And so there was a counterpoint to the Enlightenment. And finally, in discussing the undermining of morality by this financial system, I would have paid some attention to Mandeville's Fable of the Bees and his argument, which in a way was an endorsement of the criticism, because he famously argued that it was the corruption, it was the selfishness, it was the greediness of individuals, the individual bees, pursuing their self-interest, which produced the honey of national wealth. So out of private vice came public virtue. Now that's a concession, but it's also an attempt to explain how, in a way, the system, despite what you might predict because of the private vice, worked rather well, and might be one of the threads to explain why, against all the predictions of people like Hume and others, the British system didn't collapse and in the end succeeded against France and developed a new form of industrial civilization. So thank you, Richard, for a very stimulating and interesting book.